Hello, and in this video we're going to go through the fourth chapter of book one of the Art of Rhetoric, continuing on from the other videos that I've posted on this text. So this chapter is detailing the three types of oration that Aristotle mentioned in book three. Those three types were political oratory, forensic oratory, and ceremonial oratory. And in this book, in this chapter 4, Aristotle goes into the former of that list, political oratory, and he defines what it is and gives more detail on the type of information that political oratory deals with, or the types of topics that it deals with on a high level. And again, he goes to pains to make the point that rhetoric is a high level thing. You know, it's kind of an amalgam of sophistical or sophistry, argumentation, dialectical argumentation, and interestingly ethics. So it's a bridge between a method of analysis, a philosophical subject of ethics, and an act of persuasion. But fundamentally he comes to the conclusion that rhetoric is a practical faculty. In the word of Aristotle, he said a practical faculty. So, what is political oration? He defines it on the time dimension first. So, in the scale between past, present, and future, he says political oration is to do with the set of actions that are to occur or aren't to occur in the future. And then within that, he says these actions need to be probable or possible, so they need to be within the realm of probability. Politics doesn't talk about things that are impossible, and it doesn't talk about things that are certain, because things that are certain, people possibly have made their minds up on, and things that are impossible, aren't worth giving counsel on, because you cannot convince them to do that thing if it's not possible in the first place, or to not do that thing because they're not going to do it in the first place. And within the set of possible actions in the future, or possible outcomes, politics is, or political oratory to be specific, is concerned with the set of outcomes that aren't naturally random or due to providence or fate, or fortune. In his times, he'd be thinking of so-called acts of God, like earthquakes or other natural disasters. He's talking more about the set of possible outcomes that are within the control of humans, or within the control of the audience. So it's a subset of a subset of a subset. A subset in time concerning the future, a subset of actions, or the subset of probabilities less than 1 and greater than 0, and a subset of that subset, namely probabilities that are conditional on human will, that humans can influence. And then Aristotle goes on to taxonomize, as he does, the topics that political oration treats. And some of these are very topical today. If you're looking at, when I make this recording, if you're looking at the US markets and geopolitics, and you'll know which one it is when I make the list. So the matters on which men deliberate are ways and means, So ways and means being the general operation of the economy and the general available tools that a country has at its disposal to do something, and the way it does it, the techniques, the organization, the instrumentation, the infrastructure that it has to do things, to make things happen. War and peace, which is self-evident, national defense, imports and exports, and legislation. Aristotle then goes on to describe what each of these things are. So ways and means, and this is very interesting because if you go on any government's treasury website or their economic bureau, you'll see that they've done all of these things, and this was written many hundreds of years ago. So ways and means are the number and extent of the country's sources of revenue, the expenditure of the country, and he then goes on to say that if things are being overlooked, then it should be added. A country should know, politicians should know how a country earns its livelihood. And the politician should also know if something is superfluous. He mentions superfluous expenditure, which in our current context would concern deficit spending and national debt and things of that like. And then there's peace and war, so knowing the military strength of a country, that of a country's allies and its enemies, and the pecking order. He makes the obvious point that you shouldn't start a war with someone stronger than yourself, and you should know who's weaker than yourself, and therefore who you have the likelihood of defeating in the war. And he says you should study the other countries in general, so you should study the ways that other countries earn their living, and that's what China has done, and Japan had did in the 20th century before China to increase their country's welfare. They've taken technology from other countries and they've kind of emulated that and replicated that in their own countries. Just study the wars of other countries and the way they ended. And he has a phrase here which is so simple but so profound if you put it into practice, and that phrase is, similar causes are likely to have similar results. And of course that phrase underpins much of political or kind of soft scientific analysis in geopolitics, in financial markets, in business, analysis of systems that are chaotic and not completely amenable to the scientific method because there are no real controllable experiments, but are still amenable to some form of analysis, especially the financial markets and the economy, where analog in history is incredibly important. So national defense, that's about understanding the methods of defense, the lay of the land, the garrison, strategic points, food supply, what's imported, what's exported, and what other economies the country is dependent on. Aristotle says a country shouldn't offend economies that it does a lot of trade with, or are dependent upon for kind of vital imports, strategic imports, whether they be raw materials, energy, food, weapons or otherwise, but also they shouldn't offend nations that are much stronger, mightier than themselves. As for legislation, which is the final topic that Aristotle addresses, he says that this is the most important factor for a country's well-being. And the quote here is, But while he must, for security's sake, be able to take all this into account, all this being the other factors, war and peace, ways and means, national defence, imports and exports, he must, before all things, understand the subject of legislation, for it is on a country's laws that its whole welfare depends. And he says that a legislation must be applied, it actually needs to be put into place. If you go too far, a country can, be pushed into tyranny. But if you don't enforce it, a democracy turns into an oligarchy, which feels familiar. So that broadly concludes the fourth chapter, which is concerned with the information a political speaker must possess. That information being on the topics which we recounted. To repeat, those topics are ways and means, war and peace, national defence, imports and exports, and legislation. And that concludes chapter 4. See you for the next video. Thank you.